Good morning. We're going to continue on with the second part of the cardiovascular system. Pansy the answer dog is all set to go and has already had breakfast and is bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, especially because it's cold this morning. So here we go. We're going to have exchange in the capillaries. The capillaries are the vessels that have exchange between the blood and the surrounding fluids because they have such thin walls. All they are made up of basically is a single epithelial cell, as we saw before, and so there's not really much in the way of barriers between the fluids within and the fluids without, outside of the capillaries, and this lack of barriers allows for diffusion to occur. So nutrients and oxygen are going to leave the blood. The reason they leave the blood is because the concentration gradients, and they diffuse into the tissues. The fluid surrounding the cells is called interstitial fluid or tissue fluid. Waste and carbon dioxide diffuse into the blood from the tissue fluid. And why would that be? Right, concentration gradient. She's rolling her eyes because that's already written in here. The small molecules are able to leave and enter the capillaries. If they're small enough, they can go through the pores, or if they're lipid soluble, they can go through the cell membranes of the cells themselves. Large proteins in cells don't leave the plasma, and why would that be? Right, the pores are small, molecules are too big to fit through. So, excess fluids are going to go where? They go into the lymphatic capillaries. And the lymphatic capillaries are a way of returning the fluids that leave the blood back to the blood, because eventually they travel up to the vessels at the base of the neck and go into the blood vessels there. There are three things that are going to affect capillary exchange. One is the blood pressure. Another is diffusion, and another is osmotic pressure. Now, blood pressure is going to force it. The higher it is, it's going to force materials to leak out. Diffusion is going to run basically on concentration gradients, net movement from high concentration to low, and the osmotic pressure will affect the movement of water. The less water there is in one place relative to another, the water will move into that area where there's not very much water. So here we sort of summarize all this in a table, and we see that there is a change as the blood flows through the capillary. We have hydrostatic pressure. The hydrostatic pressure is constantly dropping, and the reason it's dropping is because materials are leaving. The interstitial pressure, the hydrostatic pressure of the fluid surrounding the capillary, is fairly constant. You'll notice that it is a lower value than the pressure inside. And because the pressure outside is lower than the pressure inside, the materials tend to leave the capillary. The osmotic pressure is fairly constant. Excuse me. The total outward pressure is a summation of these. So we see that it varies starting at 41 and declining down to about 26. The plasma osmotic pressure is fairly high, and so we'd have to subtract this value from the outward pressure. The plasma osmotic pressure means that the fluids are going to go back toward the blood because of the materials outside of the capillaries. And this is our net value. And you see at the venule end, the materials are actually going back into the capillary, while up to that point they've been leaking out. And this would be especially water. Okay. Excuse me. So the net positive pressure at the arterial end makes things leak out, and the net negative pressure at the venule end makes things leak in. Okay. At the arterial end, the kinds of things that leak outward are going to be water, glucose, amino acids, and these are going to be leaking out because of concentration gradients. Okay. And because these things are leaking out, they are actually creating fluid, tissue fluid, surrounding the cells. Cells and proteins don't leave because, right, they are too big. Okay. In the midsection, there are three processes are going on still, and diffusion is still occurring. Oxygen and nutrients are leaving the blood because of concentration gradients higher for these materials in the blood and lower outside. Carbon dioxide and waste materials come into the blood because their concentrations are higher outside the capillary. And then at the venous end, where the capillary is about to end, the hydrostatic pressure is down because things have left, and that means that water is going to start diffusing back into the capillary, and actually pretty close to 85% of what left initially comes back. So there's only a 15% loss of water, and that water goes into the lymph. The water, as I just said, the water that doesn't go back into the capillary goes up into the lymphatic system. Okay, so that brings us to the next set of vessels, the veins and the venules. The venules are first, they follow the capillaries, and they direct blood into the veins, and they direct blood back toward the heart. So they have very thin walls compared to the arteries, and this is okay. Why would that be okay? Right, the pressure is low, and because the pressure is low, they don't really need a lot of muscle tissue to contain that pressure. Also, in many of the veins, there are going to be semilunar valves, and these are going to have three cusps. We talked about semilunar valves before, and those semilunar valves are one-way valves. They're going to prevent blood going the wrong way. And this works in conjunction with the skeletal muscle pump to return blood from the lower appendages back to the heart. Okay, half of the blood in our system is in the veins and in the venules, and so these vessels can actually act as a reservoir for blood that can play a role when you have hemorrhaging, because these vessels can contract and drive blood back to the heart to make up for the loss in the hemorrhaging. Okay, the contraction of these vessels occurs because of sympathetic stimulation, and as I just mentioned, it's going to drive blood back to the heart. Okay, some people have varicose veins. Phlebitis is another problem that can occur. And the varicose veins typically occur when the semilunar valves fail and the blood can go the wrong way. And the wrong way would be away from the heart, back down toward the capillaries. The most common places for varicose veins are in the legs and in the thighs. And if these varicose veins occur in the rectum, they're called hemorrhoids. Okay, so phlebitis is an inflammation of vessels, and when the veins in particular, when the veins become inflamed, sometimes it causes abnormal clot formation, which can be very dangerous in terms of strokes, heart attacks, or pulmonary embolisms. Pulmonary embolisms can be deadly because they can cause the blood to pool in the pulmonary system. Pressure builds up, you get pulmonary edema, the lungs fill with fluids, and the person can die from that. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about the physiology of circulation, and we'll start with the velocity of the blood flow. So the fastest circulation is going to occur in the large vessels, the arteries, and excuse me, this is because they have a large diameter. Because they have a large diameter, they have a relatively small surface area, and because they have a small surface area, there's not very much friction. The slowest blood flow is going to be in the capillaries, and the reason that is because there's a very small diameter, the smallest of all, and that means there's more surface area, which means there's more friction. Now, you might think, oh, if they're slowing down in the capillaries, this is a bad thing. Actually not. Having the blood slow down in the capillaries is beneficial because it allows more time for exchange between the blood and the fluid surrounding the capillaries. So it helps in that very important reconditioning of the tissue fluids. As the blood leaves the capillaries and starts to go into larger and larger vessels, because the vessels are getting larger and larger, the velocity starts to increase because there's less friction, and that's because there's less surface area. There's another thing that affects the velocity. This is going to be consistent throughout the whole system, and that's viscosity. Blood is viscous, and that is, it resists flow compared with pure water. The reason that is because it's not just pure water. There are other elements within the blood, and they actually increase friction. When a blood cell is leaving the heart and then coming back, it takes about a minute for all the blood to go through the heart and back to the heart, on average. This is in a healthy person, obviously. Okay, so blood pressure. Blood pressure is what pushes the blood through the system. There's hydrostatic pressure, and the hydrostatic pressure is the pressure that's exerted against the wall of the vessel, very much like the air pressure in a tire is exerted against the walls of the tire. The highest hydrostatic pressure is going to be in the aorta, and the aorta has strong muscular walls that contract against the pressure. They contract with significant force, and they can actually cause the blood to move through the system. The lowest blood pressure is going to be in the vena cava, and the vena cava is the greatest distance from the left ventricle, and that's where most of this hydrostatic pressure is being generated. Okay, so hydrostatic pressure fluctuates in the arteries, and this is in direct response to the cardiac cycle. So it's going to be highest when the ventricles are contracting, systole, and it's going to be lowest during the diastole of the ventricles, when the ventricles are relaxing and they are no longer creating a pressure gradient. You might wonder, why does the pressure gradient not drop to zero? The reason it doesn't drop to zero is because the vessels were stretched during systole, the systolic phase of the ventricles, and then when the ventricle relaxes, those vessels contract against the fluid inside them, and the pressure drops, but it doesn't typically go to zero. Okay. So the mean arterial blood pressure is going to be equal to the cardiac output times the peripheral resistance. Cardiac output we represent with CO, and peripheral resistance, PR. The peripheral resistance is primarily because of the friction due to the vessel walls. Excuse me. So with smaller diameter vessels, we have an increase in resistance, and the reason would be, right, the surface area. Also, the more length, we have more resistance, and that will be because, right, the resistance is, or the friction is occurring over a longer distance. Okay, and this is kind of a scary thing to be aware of. In fact, I had sort of forgotten about this, but if you increase your body mass by getting an extra pound of fat, it actually increases about 200 miles worth of blood vessel length. Since you're getting more length, that means there's more resistance, so by becoming fat, you actually increase the amount of work that your heart has to do to pump blood. Okay, so blood pressure and cardiac output go hand in hand. The heart rate is under extrinsic control, so we have nerves and hormones that affect the heart rate. Sympathetic stimulation tends to increase the heart rate and therefore increase blood pressure. Parasympathetic stimulation tends to decrease heart rate and therefore decrease blood pressure. And if you do get an increase in heart rate, the heart speeds up, there's going to be more cardiac output. More output means more pressure. So, an increase in stroke volume also is going to increase the pressure. So if you have one contraction and not very much blood leaves the heart, that's not going to have a big impact on pressure. If you have one contraction and a lot of blood leaves the heart, pressure is going to go up because of that. So both heart rate and stroke volume increase pressure if they increase. And the thing that's kind of a key to all this is that the venous return has to be adequate. If you don't have enough blood coming back to the heart, then the heart's not going to be able to pump out more blood. Okay, so venous return. Venous return is going to be because of, well, from the lower appendages, primarily skeletal muscle pump and the one-way valves, and from superior to the heart, it will come back because of gravity. The venous pressure is fairly small, and the higher the venous pressure is, the more blood will go into the right atrium. If there's pressure in the right atrium already because blood is in there, that's going to reduce the amount of blood coming back into the right atrium. So as I said, skeletal muscle pump is going to be driving blood back toward the right atrium. The respiratory pump does as well. Sometimes I sort of neglect that. I don't really pay that much mind. But the act of breathing pumps blood from our viscera, especially in the thoracic cavity, back to the heart. Okay. And then another thing that affects the venous return is going to be the total blood volume. So the more blood you have, the more comes back to the heart. And you might think, well, how can the blood volume change? This is primarily affected by the amount of water in the blood, and that's controlled by the kidneys primarily. So if the venous pressure is relative to the right atrium is high, then there's going to be more return. If it's the venous pressure is low relative to the right atrial pressure, then the venous return is going to be low. And as I mentioned already, skeletal muscle pump and the respiratory pump are going to help force blood back toward the heart. So we've talked about the skeletal muscle pump a number of times before. It's hugely important, not just for moving blood back toward the heart, but also moving lymphatic fluids through the system. We haven't done much with the respiratory pump, and when you breathe in because you've lowered the pressure within the thoracic cavity. This happens because the diaphragm contracts and moves inferiorly, and the volume of the thoracic cavity increases. When that happens, that lowers the pressure in the thoracic cavity. But when the diaphragm moves inferiorly, it increases pressure in the abdominal cavity. And so you have low pressure in the thoracic cavity, you have high pressure in the abdominal cavity, and the blood is going to flow from high pressure to low, so it returns from the abdominal cavity back to the thoracic cavity. Greater volume of blood obviously means there's going to be greater return. Lower volume of blood means less return. So with hemorrhaging, there's a lower volume, lower pressure. And as I mentioned, water is the primary factor that affects the blood volume, and that is primarily regulated by the kidneys. So if you have retention of water, the pressure is going to increase. Okay, so we've got blood pressure and peripheral resistance. The peripheral resistance, remember we had cardiac output was one factor and peripheral resistance was the other. The peripheral resistance is primarily regulated by our nervous system, especially the sympathetic nerves, and it can also be regulated by hormones. So the regulation by nerves, we'll start there. There's a vasomotor center in the medulla oblongata at the base of the brain, and that's going to control vasoconstriction. If you have low blood pressure, this would be detected by baroreceptors. We talked about those both in the aorta and the carotid arteries, and they stimulate the cardioregulatory center to send out sympathetic signals along the sympathetic nerves, and they cause constriction of the arterioles. Okay, So the arterioles constrict. The sympathetic nervous stimulation will increase heart rate. Heart rate, when it goes up, increases blood pressure, and when the arterioles constrict, it increases blood pressure because there's more resistance peripherally. So both cardiac output increase and peripheral resistance increase, the blood pressure goes up. High blood pressure is going to affect the baroreceptors. They signal, under the conditions with high blood pressure, they're going to signal the cardio-regulatory center, and they decrease the heart rate and they allow the arterioles to dilate. A decrease in heart rate and dilation of the arterioles is going to reduce peripheral resistance and reduce cardiac output, and that lowers the blood pressure. By the way, there's a sort of an unfortunate thing about the baroreceptors, and that is that they can accommodate to pressure. So if you have a chronically high blood pressure, this response to bring the blood pressure down goes away over time. Similarly, if you have chronically low blood pressure, the response eventually starts to go away and you stop correcting for that. Okay. So nervous regulation can also direct flow into specific areas of need. Some areas that need more blood flow to satisfy their requirements will be able to get more blood by this dilation of the arterioles leading into those capillaries, and the areas that don't need as much will have vasoconstriction, and that reduces the blood flow into areas that don't need the blood flow as much. This is really important because we don't have an infinite amount of blood to pump all through the body, so we have to manage what we do have and make it count the most by sending it to where it is needed the most. There are precapillary sphincters. These can also help direct the flow. They constrict automatically when there are plenty of oxygen in the blood in their capillaries, and then they fatigue as the blood oxygen levels start to drop, and when they fatigue they relax, and it allows the blood to flow into that area. So this is a very cool sort of auto-regulatory control that allows the blood to go or not go into areas based on need. Okay, hormones. Hormones have the ability to increase blood pressure. The two hormones that have the biggest effect are epinephrine and norepinephrine. These are both produced by the adrenal glands. They tend to increase heart rate. They tend to constrict the subcutaneous capillaries, which means, or arterioles leading into those, which means that the blood won't be sent as much to the surface areas. They also constrict blood vessels leading into the kidneys. That means that the kidney output will reduce. That conserves water, which helps keep the blood pressure up, and also blood going into the abdominal viscera. The abdominal viscera tend not to have high needs for oxygen and nutrients in general, and so you can direct the blood into areas that are more important, and these conditions would be skeletal muscle, the brain, and the heart. Okay. Low blood volume or low sodium within the blood will cause an enzyme to be secreted by the kidneys. Now this is going to lead to a hormonal control, but it starts with an enzyme. The enzyme is called renin, and renin converts a blood protein, angiotensin, into angiotensin 1. The angiotensin 1 in the blood angiotensinogen goes to angiotensin 1. The lungs take the angiotensin 1 and convert it into angiotensin 2. This is kind of complicated. Pansy's rolling her eyes. So the angiotensin 2 causes vasoconstriction. This is going to lower or increase blood pressure. And it also causes the adrenal cortex to release the hormone aldosterone. Aldosterone is an important hormone in regulating sodium in our blood, and it causes the kidney to retain sodium. And when sodium is retained, the blood volume goes up. When the blood volume goes up, the blood pressure goes up. So the obvious question you should be asking yourself is, sodium ions don't take up very much space. How can they create more blood volume by having more sodium in your blood? If you retain sodium, then in the kidneys, water will follow the sodium rather than being released by the kidney. It's retained, and when the water is retained, your blood volume goes up. Some of these things you have to kind of think them through a little bit. They're not always intuitive right on the surface. We also have another hormone, antidiuretic hormone, ADH, that's released from the posterior pituitary gland. That's released if sodium is high, and that causes the water to be reabsorbed by the kidney to dilute the sodium. Effectively, that's what happens. Anti means against, right? And diuresis is the release of urine. So ADH reduces the amount of urine that's being produced. So if you have water, high blood volume being retained, that's going to cause vasoconstriction, and the vasoconstriction is going to increase the blood pressure. This is kind of complicated, actually. What if we need to decrease the pressure? Hormones can help there too. So you'll remember when we talked about the heart that we said it did have an endocrine function, that it produces the atrial natriuretic hormone, ANH. This is released when the atria are stretched. The atria would be stretched during times when there's a lot of blood return to the heart. And when you stretch those and this hormone is released, it inhibits the release of renin by the kidney, and also aldosterone from the adrenal glands, and both of those would result in lower kidney output. So by inhibiting, or ultimately they would cause allow the kidney to release more fluid, and if you release more fluid, then the blood volume drops, and if the blood volume drops, then the blood pressure drops. It's sort of a series of events. Also, ANH causes sodium to be excreted from the body. Now, usually when we're talking about excretion, we're talking about a waste product. In this case, the sodium isn't actually a waste product, but it would be in excess. And by getting rid of sodium, the water follows it because of osmosis. And when the water follows it, that means your blood volume drops. So the excess sodium is surplus sodium, not waste sodium. We don't produce waste product of sodium. How do we evaluate circulation? There are several things that we can do with a patient to look at whether the circulatory system is behaving normally or not. One is the pulse. And the pulse occurs because of the surge of blood that goes into the arteries when the ventricles contract, ventricular systole. And this causes the arteries to stretch. With diastole, the pressure starts to drop and the arteries become smaller diameter, so they return back to their original shape. You can palpate the pulse in superficial arteries in various places within the body, and there are actually 11 pulse points. And here are a number of them. We also have, additionally, the popliteal artery, that's behind the knee. Obviously the foot, posterior tibial, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? There are two others, the axillary. Axillary is within the axilla, and facial arteries, you can pick up pulses there. This, I mentioned about the popliteal, it looks like it's pointing to the anterior side of the knee, but it's actually on the posterior side of the knee. Okay. You should palpate with your fingers and not your thumb. And so why not your thumb? Pan's thumb is kind of not very functional anyway. Right, the thumb has its own pulse. And the average pulse for a normal person is going to be about 70 beats per minute, but it can range between 60 and 80. So here's kind of an interesting thing. If you have an athlete, especially an athlete that's involved in extreme endurance kinds of activities, they often have relatively low pulse rates. We also have blood pressure. That's another way we can evaluate the health of the circulatory system. And the blood pressure is usually measured proximal. You put a pressure cuff proximal to the cuvette. The cuvette is extending from the elbow toward the wrist. And you use a sphygmomanometer. Wow, that's a mouthful. And these pressure cuffs are going to be inflated until the point where they stop the blood flowing into the forearm, and then gradually release the pressure. The artery, the prime artery that you're trying to compress and stop is the brachial artery. It goes down into the forearm, into the radial and the ulnar arteries. And you release the pressure gradually. And when you do that, you start to hear some sounds. Okay. Our first sound is going to be the systolic pressure, blood pressure. And then the second sound is going to be the diastolic pressure. The blood is turbulent in the vessels, and the turbulence causes vibration, and that's actually the vibrations are what you hear. If you remember when we talked about the sounds from the heart, we got vibrations because of the closing of the heart valves. These vibrations in the vessels are called Korotkov sounds. Wow, that's a crazy name. Must have been named after some guy with that name or some woman with that name. So as I mentioned, the first sound is going to be the systolic pressure of the left ventricle. And when the sound stops, we've found the diastolic pressure of the left ventricle. Normal resting pressure is 120/80. So sometimes people have low blood pressure. Low blood pressure is called hypotension. And orthostatic hypotension occurs in your brain when you stand up, and this is just because of gravity. This usually is corrected very rapidly with a reflexive change in the heart rate and contraction strength, so that it almost is imperceptible that any change occurs. And that's a good thing, because if there were a drop in blood pressure in the brain, you would pass out. Okay. Also, you can have low blood pressure if you're hemorrhaging, obviously if you're bleeding. Burns can cause low blood pressure because there tends to be a loss of fluids when somebody is burned. Vomiting or diarrhea can lead to low blood pressure because you're losing fluids that you otherwise would absorb from the gastrointestinal tract. And if the pressure gets low enough, this can lead to shock. Shock is an interesting thing. If it is prolonged, it can actually become fatal and irreversible. So if someone is going into shock because of an injury or some kind of trauma or whatever, it needs to be treated quickly. You need to respond quickly because it can become fatal. And once it goes past a certain threshold, there is no coming back. Hypertension is high blood pressure. Typically 140 for systolic pressure is considered high blood pressure, and 90 for diastolic is considered high blood pressure. Actually, of the two, you might think the 140 is more problematic. The high diastolic pressure is actually more dangerous because it means that the system is being stressed all the time, whereas if you have a normal diastolic but a high systolic, at least some of the time the system is going back into a normal range and is able to recover. There is something referred to as essential hypertension, and there isn't any actually precise cause for that. Protracted hypertension can lead to stroke or heart attack, and one of the problems, for example, with congestive heart failure, if you have protracted periods of time with hypertension, the heart is being overworked and it starts to stretch more than it should, and it can spiral into congestive heart failure. We'll actually address congestive heart failure later on in this lecture. There can be many possible contributing factors for hypertension. It could be genetics. Some people just are that way because of their genetic makeup. It can be diet, it can be lifestyle, stress. And one of the things that an individual can do to reduce hypertension is obviously try to remove stress if that's the issue, or remove the things in your life that are causing you to be hypertensive, adjusting the diet, and also medication. There are medications to reduce cardiac activity. So circulatory routes. This is pretty much straight anatomy. Remember, there were two systems: the pulmonary blood flow and the systemic. We'll start with the pulmonary. And this is a little bit on the dry side, but this is something you're going to need to know for your exam, so you should be paying attention to this. We have the right atrium going to the right ventricle, and doing that it goes over the tricuspid valve into the pulmonary trunk. To get to the pulmonary trunk, it has to go over the pulmonary semilunar valve, out into the pulmonary arteries, then arterioles, pulmonary arterioles to the pulmonary capillaries. Pulmonary capillaries, as we'll see in the respiratory lecture, are pressed right up against the walls of the alveoli. Then from there to the pulmonary venules, to the four pulmonary veins, and back to the left atrium. Functionally, the pulmonary system is very important for respiratory gas exchange. Remember that we pick up oxygen in the lungs into our blood, and we get rid of carbon dioxide. And also, by getting rid of carbon dioxide, we adjust the pH of the blood. The pH of the blood tends to be lower when there's a lot of carbon dioxide, and higher when you get rid of it, so the pH returns back toward normal. Systemic blood flow is going to start in the left atrium. The blood came into the left atrium from four vessels, the four pulmonary veins, goes over the bicuspid or mitral valve to the left ventricle, then over the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta, and then out into the branches of the aorta. So it's going to go to systemic arteries, then systemic arterioles, systemic capillaries. Then from the capillaries it goes into systemic venules, and then the two main veins bringing blood back to the heart of the superior and inferior vena cava. And then we have the one structure that's not actually a vein, the coronary sinus, and those three vessels, or those three structures rather, bring blood back to the right atrium. And we start over again. Systemic blood flow is going to be functionally important for getting blood out to the organs, recondition the blood. So things like the liver, the small intestine, the kidneys, things of that nature, the endocrine glands. It's also going to be important for distributing the nutrients and removing waste from the tissues, from the tissue fluids. So we have some major arteries, and again, this is pretty much straight anatomy, but we'll try to be aware of the more important vessels. We have, coming off of the ascending aorta, the left and right coronary arteries, which are important for bringing blood to the walls of the heart. Then we have the aortic arch. Coming from the aortic arch are going to be the brachiocephalic artery. There's only one of those. It's not a left and a right. And the brachiocephalic is going to give rise to a subclavian and the right subclavian and the right common carotid. We also have the left common carotid coming from the aortic arch, and the left subclavian coming from the aortic arch. And then we have the descending aorta. The descending aorta is going to have the intercostal arteries that go out into the subcostal groove of the ribs. And then eventually the aorta gets to the abdomen, passes through the diaphragm, the level of T12 body. Just as a point of information, it passes through posteriorly. And the first ventral branch off the aorta is the celiac trunk, which serves the liver and the gallbladder, and actually quite a bit of the gastrointestinal tract, the stomach. We have a superior mesenteric artery sending blood out to the pancreas and parts of the small intestine. We have the left and right renal arteries. Those are lateral branches. They go out to the kidneys. We have left and right gonadal arteries, so they're going to go to the gonads, either to the testicles or the ovaries. Interesting thing is that the testicular arteries and the ovarian arteries leave the aorta at about the same point in the abdomen, but obviously the testicular arteries end up all the way down in the scrotal sac. And you might ask yourself, why is that? Why don't they come from someplace closer to where the testicles are? And the reason is the testicles started out inside of the body cavity and descended. We have the inferior mesenteric. Inferior mesenteric is going to mostly do the rectum and parts of the large intestine. Other parts of the large intestine. Rectum is part of the large intestine. We have left and right common iliac. The common iliacs are going to bifurcate into internal and external iliacs. The internal iliacs serve the pelvic region. The external iliac becomes the femoral and goes down into the thigh. Now, in terms of the veins, we have the left and right brachiocephalic veins. They're going to converge to form the superior vena cava. There are other veins, by the way. We're just doing the major ones. Inferiorly, we have left and right common iliacs. They're going to converge to form the inferior vena cava. The inferior vena cava is going to receive the right gonadal and the left and right renal. So you might think, well, what about the left gonadal? The left gonadal actually joins the left renal vein to go in to the vena cava. We have left and right hepatic. So hepatic means liver, right? Those are going to come from the liver. And all those come together into the vena cava, inferior vena cava. Now we also have a couple of special situations with respect to circulation, specialized circulatory systems, if you will, subsystems. And one of them is the hepatic portal system. This turns out to be really important. It's not just a curiosity. In portal systems, we have blood going through two capillary beds before they get back to the heart chamber. Normally, there'd only be one capillary bed before the blood gets back to the heart chamber. And the hepatic portal system is a great example. So we'll talk about this one a little bit because it really is more than just a curiosity. We'll see that it has 6 major functions, really important physiological functions. So blood goes out into the capillaries of the small intestine, and then it drains from the small intestine into the intestinal veins. The intestinal veins go into the superior mesenteric vein, which is going to be joined by the gastroepiploic. Epiploic, by the way, means omentum. So this is coming from the stomach and the greater omentum. And the superior mesenteric goes into a major vessel, the hepatic portal vein. In addition, we have colic veins draining into the inferior mesenteric vein. The inferior mesenteric vein joins the splenic, and that trunk from those two areas drains into the hepatic portal. Gastric veins go directly to the hepatic portal vein, and then the hepatic portal vein carries blood to the liver. The blood from that vein drains into hepatic capillaries, and the liver has an opportunity at that point to modify the contents of the blood, and then once they leave those hepatic capillaries, it gets sent back to the heart by the hepatic vein, not a hepatic portal, hepatic vein, and then the hepatic vein drains into the inferior vena cava, and then the inferior vena cava sends the blood back to the heart, and then the blood gets distributed to the body. So we use our liver as and we'll talk about this in the digestive system. The liver is basically a management organ that manages the contents of the blood. So here is a schematic of what we just said. We we have the heart bringing blood down. You see that blood goes from the aorta into the celiac trunk and then the hepatic artery. This is not part of the hepatic portal system, this vessel right here. Okay, but then the aorta also brings blood down to the small intestine, goes into the intestinal capillaries, and leaves by way of a series of veins that eventually get it to the hepatic portal vein. Hepatic portal vein brings the blood back up into the liver. Okay. So hepatic artery, I mentioned, is a branch off the celiac trunk, the first ventral branch of the aorta in the abdomen. It supplies blood to the liver. It is not part of the hepatic portal system. Okay, then the portal vein goes in, blood goes into the capillaries in the liver. The liver modifies the contents of the blood and sends it into the hepatic vein. This is not the portal vein, this is the hepatic portal, this is the hepatic vein. And the hepatic vein just goes into the inferior vena cava, carries blood back to the heart, and then the blood gets distributed to the rest of the body. Okay, so there are some significant physiological benefits of this hepatic portal system. One is that it takes high pH blood from the stomach to the liver. And you might think, how is that beneficial? Well, that balances, or principally balances, the low pH blood coming from the pancreas. The pancreas sends blood through the hepatic portal system to the liver as well. And so when you have high pH blood and low pH blood mixing, it tends to balance out the pH mostly. Any imbalance that remains in terms of pH in the blood at this point will be managed by the kidneys. It takes nutrient-rich blood from the small intestines to the liver. We use that because remember I said that the liver actually processes our nutrients and manages the nutrient load in the blood that's going throughout the body. It takes bilirubin from the spleen to the liver. Now, we didn't talk about the bilirubin at this point. We're going to be talking about that when we get to the accessory organs of the gastrointestinal tract. But when blood cells become old, they become fragile. When they go into the spleen, they burst. The hemoglobin is released into the plasma. Obviously, hemoglobin is important when it's inside of red blood cells, but when it's in the plasma, it's junk. So there are phagocytic cells that take the hemoglobin in, they metabolize it and release a waste product called bilirubin. It's a yellow-colored material, and the liver takes that bilirubin and converts it into bile pigments. The bile pigments are excreted in the bile. The hepatic portal system allows us to recycle bile salts quickly. In fact, we can recycle bile salts 2 or 3 times within the digestive process of one meal, and those bile salts are important for emulsifying lipids that you've consumed. And the sixth important activity of the hepatic portal system is to take glucagon, a hormone that the pancreas releases, directly to the liver. Now, when you have low blood sugar, when you have low blood glucose, the pancreas is stimulated to release glucagon from the islet cells of the pancreas, and the glucagon goes directly to the liver and causes the liver to release glucose into the blood, so that brings the blood glucose back up to more normal levels. So it's really a big deal. It sounds like just kind of a curiosity initially, but it really is physiologically very important. There's another pituitary system, or another portal system, the hypothalamus pituitary portal system, and this system is going to facilitate rapid transport of hormones that are released from the hypothalamus to the anterior portion of the pituitary gland, where they can affect the activity of the pituitary gland. We also have an unusual system that supplies blood to the brain, and that's obviously important because without blood going to the brain, your brain would not function. This is going to be, or there are 2 major sets of vessels bring blood up into the cranium to the brain. One set of vessels are the vertebral arteries, left and right. The vertebral arteries are going to pass through the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebrae, and they come together and form the basilar artery. Also, we have internal carotid arteries. These are branches off the carotid. There's a left and a right, and they come together and they form the cerebral arterial circle, or the circle of Willis. So, what is the advantage of this circle? The circle provides for blood coming from two directions to bring its materials into the brain, and this is beneficial because if one of those directions gets blocked, the blood can still get into the brain. Now, if you remember, I think we talked about this, there is no collateral circulation within the brain itself, but this is sort of external to the brain, so it does bring blood in from a couple of directions there. And also the circle helps equalize blood pressure within the brain, which is very important. Okay, fetal circulation. Fetal circulation is very interesting and unusual. It's got four unique features that we'll address. We have a foraminal valley. We have a ductus arteriosus, or arterial duct. We have the umbilical arteries, and there are two of them, a left and a right, and one umbilical vein. And we have the ductus venosus, or venous duct. We'll discuss each of these. So, foraminal valley is going to be between the left and the right atrium in the interatrial septum. There's a flap that is hanging out into the left atrium, and eventually that closes off the foramen when the baby is born, or at least normally it would be. What is the function of this? It provides for the first fetal bypass of pulmonary circulation. It allows blood to be diverted away from the lungs and into the left side of the heart, so that the fetal circulation, not all of the blood goes to the lungs. The ductus arteriosus or arterial duct is going to go directly from the pulmonary trunk to the aorta, and it is the second fetal bypass of pulmonary circulation. So again, all the blood leaving the right ventricle doesn't go to the lungs. A significant amount of it goes directly into the aorta. So there are two pulmonary bypasses, and that means that only a portion of the blood that the heart pumps in the fetus goes to the lungs. So the obvious question is this okay? Well, before we address is it okay, we have to address a couple of basic facts. And the first question is, and we'll bring Pansy in here because she's an extremely knowledgeable individual with respect to this. Where does the fetus get its respiratory gas exchange? That is, where does the fetal blood pick up its oxygen, and where does the fetal blood get rid of its carbon dioxide? Right, the placenta. Okay. Next, where does the fetus get its nutrients? That is, oh, and by the way, with the respiratory gas exchange, remember that the fetal lungs are not working. So the baby is not breathing, the fetus is not breathing, so there isn't any possibility for exchange within the lungs, or at least not from any air, because there isn't any air. So where does it get its nutrients? Right, the placenta. You notice that she's really good with this. The fetus doesn't eat, and it doesn't take material into its gastrointestinal tract. So it has to get nutrients from someplace, and it's getting from the fetus. And then the third question is, where does the fetus get rid of most of its waste products other than carbon dioxide? Well, even carbon dioxide, we can include that. And the answer is, right, the placenta. The lungs aren't working, so you can't get rid of carbon dioxide there. And the gastrointestinal tract is not working, so you can't get rid of any waste there. And the kidneys aren't working, so there can't be any waste going out through the urinary system. So the placenta turns out to be sort of critical here, and the umbilical arteries and the umbilical vein are an important piece of that puzzle. The blood is carried to the placenta. It's mixed blood, and we'll see why in a little bit here. Mixed blood means that it's not oxygen rich and it's not oxygen deficient. It's somewhere in between. But this mixed blood is going to get carried to the placenta by way of the umbilical arteries, and then oxygen rich blood is going to come back from the placenta by way of the umbilical vein. Because remember, that's where the oxygen is being picked up, in the placenta. So the most oxygen rich blood in the fetus is going to be in the coming back from the placenta by way of that umbilical vein. Excuse me. When the umbilical vein gets into the abdomen, there is another abnormal situation, and that is the ductus venosus. And the ductus venosus is a bypass of the liver. Now, we had two other unusual situations where we had bypasses. We had two fetal bypasses of the lungs. Oh, by the way, here's a good question for you. I said that the lungs aren't functional, and so that's not where we're getting oxygen, that's not where we're getting carbon dioxide. The fetus benefits by not sending all the blood to the lungs because that would be a waste of effort. So does any blood have to go to the lungs? And the answer is yes, sure it does. Why would that be? Right, because the lungs are alive and they need a blood supply. So they're not functioning in terms of reconditioning the blood, but they are a destination for some blood so that the lungs can grow. Okay. Now, the ductus venosus is a bypass of the fetal liver. And so you might ask yourself, is that a good idea? Actually, it's essential. Without that, too much blood pressure would be going into the liver, and the liver would be destroyed. And the fetus could live without a liver until it was born. And then when it would be born, not having a liver would be, it would cause its death. Okay. So this ductus venosus is a connection between the umbilical vein and the inferior vena cava. It's just a shunt or a bypass. Okay. And it reduces the pressure on the liver. It also is going to shunt oxygen-rich blood toward the brain more quickly. All right. Now, here are a couple of important things with respect to the fetal circulation. The maternal blood and the fetal blood do not mix normally. Could they ever mix? Sure, if they were hemorrhaging, there could be mixing. It could happen at birth, but normally they don't mix. And the development of these specialized maternal capillaries has been a big, important piece of making this association of maternal and fetal blood effective. These maternal capillaries are referred to as sinusoids. They're big spaces that the maternal blood goes into, and this the fetal blood vessels grow into that space, sort of like into a reservoir. The analogy I like to use is the fetal blood vessels growing into the space are like the roots of a plant and growing into potting soil, and the potting soil would be the mother's blood, and the plant can extract materials from the potting soil that the plant needs, and basically that's what's going on with the fetal vessels. The one difference is that the fetal vessels not only extract materials that they need, but they also get rid of waste products, and that's not so much the case with the plant roots. But otherwise, it's a pretty good analogy. It even kind of looks like roots of a plant growing into potting soil. Now, having very efficient exchange is good news and bad news, and the good news is right, the fetal needs are taken care of. Bad news is that if the mother abuses herself, she's also abusing the fetus. Perhaps unknowingly, but that's the basis of that. So if the mother drinks alcoholic beverages, the fetus gets alcoholic beverages, and if that occurs during certain critical periods of development, that can lead to permanent damage to the individual that is at that point a fetus. There are also some bad news that's nobody's fault. That would be RH incompatibilities, And if the mother has Rh negative blood, and if she has been exposed to Rh positive blood in the past, her blood will have antibodies that would destroy Rh positive blood cells. If the baby is Rh positive in blood type, then the baby's blood cells would be destroyed by those, and that would, if untreated, that would kill the baby. So there are ways of getting around that. RhoGAM can suppress the mother's immune response, and the baby can, or the fetus can develop normally. So here we have a picture. You remember I used the analogy of potting soils and roots of trees. If we were to rotate this picture clockwise 90 degrees, here would be one pot of potting soil, and the soil would be the mother's blood, and here we have the roots. Those would be the fetal blood vessels growing into the space with the maternal blood. And we have color changes here. We go from red, which would be oxygen rich, gradually over to blue, which is oxygen deficient. So the obvious question is, well, where's the mother's oxygen going? And the obvious answer is the fetal blood is picking up the oxygen. So the fetal blood is coming in blue and leaving red, right? Okay. There's the sinusoid. There are the fetal vessels. There's a maternal vein. So the red blood here is going back through the umbilical vein. There's only one of those. And the blue blood coming in would be umbilical arteries. There are two of those. Now, this is a little misleading because we've used blue and red to indicate oxygen levels before. And if you remember, I told you that the fetal blood is actually mixed. And we'll see why in a little bit. But it's not really oxygen deficient. So we'll start with some diagrams of the fetal organs. We have the lung and the heart. And I want to point something out right here. You notice that there's this little flap. This little flap, there's actually two flaps, but you notice how it's leaning to the left, into the left atrium. You can tell this is the left atrium because there are the four pulmonary vein openings. Here's the inferior vena cava, superior vena cava. This does not show the coronary sinus. Coronary sinus would be coming right here. Okay, and the reason this is leaning to the left is because more blood comes into the right side, right atrium, than comes into the left atrium from vessels, and so because there's more blood coming into the right side, there's more blood pressure, and that pushes these flaps into the left atrium. So a significant amount of the blood goes directly into the left atrium. Because of that, there's less blood going into the right ventricle than normal. Right ventricle pumps blood out to the lungs, and then it comes back to the left atrium, but not all the blood is going through that pulmonary side, so there's not as much coming in from the lungs. That's why there's a disparity between the blood pressures in these two atria, at least during the fetal phase. We have the liver. Save the liver. Which is from Julia Childs, those of you who have ever heard of her. We have the urinary bladder. Okay, urinary bladder is going to be served by a branch off of the umbilical arteries, and then we have the placenta. So we have some colors here. We have oxygen-rich blood, red arrows coming in from the umbilical vein. We have oxygen-deficient blood in the inferior vena cava. The red and blue mix to make purple. So the mixed blood is coming in from the inferior vena cava. At the same time, we have blue arrows coming from the coronary sinus and the superior vena cava. Those are both oxygen deficient. Okay. Okay. Then we have this mixed blood going from the right atrium. So it doesn't have as much oxygen as it did when it was the inferior vena cava, but it's still considered mixed. A significant amount goes right through the foramen ovale into the left atrium, down into the left ventricle, and some of that mixed blood does make its way into the right ventricle. Okay, then when the heart contracts, blood is pumped out. The pulmonary trunk takes the blood to the lungs. It's mixed blood, and it comes back to the left atrium. Okay, from the left atrium it goes into the left ventricle. Okay, there was also mixed blood coming in from the right atrium into the left ventricle. And then the aorta sends blood through the body. Now you noticed I used color purple for mixed blood in the pulmonary circulation and comes back to the left atrium. In fact, some oxygen is used up by the lung tissue because the lung tissue is alive and it's growing, but not large amounts. So only some of that oxygen gets used up. Then we have the descending aorta bringing blood down to the common iliacs and eventually the internal iliac and then the umbilical artery. And the umbilical artery carries blood out to the placenta. Okay, and a branch off that serves the urinary bladder. I think I mentioned that to you. Okay. When a baby is born, some changes come about. And one of the changes is normally the foramen ovale becomes the fossa ovalis. So when the baby is born and it starts to breathe, the pressure on the lungs increases and more blood comes back to the left atrium than it had been before birth. And that extra pressure in the left atrium pushes those two flaps up against the interatrial septum, and it closes off the opening, and the opening becomes the fossa ovalis. That would be normally. Also normally, although not immediately, the ductus arteriosus becomes the ligamentum arteriosum. So that change comes about because of the hormone oxytocin. The walls of the ductus arteriosus contract and squeeze, and it no longer is a bypass. That may take up to 2 weeks. This foramen ovale becoming fossa ovalis normally happens immediately, as soon as the baby starts to breathe. But this one can take a little while. The umbilical vein shrivels up, becomes the ligamentum arteriosum. The ductus venosus also shrivels up and becomes the ligamentum venosum. Okay, so the umbilical artery is going to shrivel and they become ligaments, with the exception of the branch that serves the urinary bladder. That will persist until the adult. Now there are some possible problems. Not everything goes perfectly. So patent ductus arteriosus means that the ductus arteriosus doesn't shrivel up and it continues to be a bypass from the pulmonary trunk to the aorta. That one's pretty easy to fix. You can put a suture around it and squeeze it and make it into a ligament. Persistent foramen ovale, that one's a little more difficult to address. It happens in a certain percentage of children when they're born, and usually requires surgery at some point to close that off. Usually that surgery is postponed to allow the heart to get a little bit larger and everything before tackling that problem. So people get old, and when they get old there are effects on the cardiovascular system. Typically the heart gets larger with advanced age. Adipose tissue starts to cover the heart. The valves thicken and become more ridged, and that means that they're not going to be as effective. The heart rate is usually going to decrease at rest and also decrease during exercise, meaning that the capacity for exercise is diminished. The pumping capacity typically drops off. Now, another thing that happens in advanced age sometimes is that people get hypertension. And this can be the result of kidney diseases, it can be a result of hardening of the arteries, arteriosclerosis, and things that can help reduce these problems can include changes in diet and exercise. Congestive heart failure, this is like a really big deal. And worth making a little bit of note about. This happens in people. Typically the heart becomes enlarged. The left side of the heart doesn't pump adequately, and because of that the pulmonary pressure increases. When the pulmonary pressure increases, you get leaking of fluids out of the pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli, which results in pulmonary edema. And if that progresses too far, it can become lethal. Also, kidney activity is often affected adversely during congestive heart failure. The kidney activity is less because there's less pressure. Pressure actually, as we'll see when we address the kidneys is essential to allow for exchange, and the result of reduced kidney activity is fluid buildup. And if the fluid builds up, then blood volume goes up, and the blood volume goes up, the blood pressure goes up. Okay. So when the heart becomes overstretched from this additional blood volume and so forth, it becomes less effective, and it can't contract as well, and that can lead to heart attack. So how do we treat this? There are the 3 Ds of treating congestive heart failure. Diuretics. Diuretics are going to increase cardiac output and reduce blood volume. Digoxin, which is going to increase the cardiac contraction force, therefore ejecting more blood. And dilators. If you get vasodilators, you can cause the arterioles to dilate, which reduces the peripheral resistance, which reduces the blood pressure. Okay. There are some other things that can be done to treat congestive heart failure. You can get a left ventricular assist device, LVAD, which assists in pumping the blood. You can get a heart transplant. That sounds like a trivial thing. It's not a trivial thing, but that is an option. And varicose veins, we'll talk a little bit more about those. We mentioned those before. One of the real problems with varicose veins is that there's the potential for abnormal clots to form. This can lead to pulmonary thrombosis, blood clots in the lung, strokes, heart attacks, all sort of tragic outcomes from those kinds of things. Obviously, anticoagulants can be taken. Aspirin is a simple one to take. Half an aspirin per day can reduce the likelihood of blood clot problems. So in terms of homeostasis, there are a bunch of things we need to do. Homeostasis is going to help maintain the composition of the blood, the pH, and the temperature. I mentioned that the important part of blood is a transportation system. We transport materials throughout the body and have exchange with the tissues. And the blood is going to depend on a number of structures within the body, organs within the body to help. Bone marrow is going to supply red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. We talked about that back when we talked about bones. The respiratory system is obviously critical in maintaining the respiratory gas concentrations, gas exchange, and also in aiding and regulating the pH of the blood. This is not the major way we regulate the pH of the blood, but it is certainly an important component. The urinary system, which is the major way we regulate the pH of the blood. The electrolytes, water, nitrogenous waste, and other materials are also regulated by the kidneys. The digestive system, essential for replacing materials that are used up or lost, nutrients, water, electrolytes. Liver is going to be important in regulating the nutrient load of the blood. We talked about that. Also, the liver is going to secrete bile, which helps in the digestive process. We will be talking about that. And it detoxifies the blood by getting rid of some waste, one of which is bilirubin, which is a potential waste. But also, more important are urea. Urea is taken care of by the liver and converted to ammonia. We'll talk about the functions of the liver. The liver has more major functions than any other organ of the body. Skeletal muscles, they're going to help regulate body temperature by releasing heat. So if you're cold, your skeletal muscles can bring your body temperature up by contracting. The integumental system is also going to help regulate heat by radiating it into the surroundings, or if you get vasoconstriction into the superficial areas, you can conserve heat in the body core. Also maintaining blood pressure. Heart obviously is going to be the major way that we maintain blood pressure. It creates pressure to move the blood. and we have the brain regulating the heart contraction rate and contraction strength. And the brain is going to regulate arterial diameter, which affects the peripheral resistance. Lymphatic system is going to be important in returning fluids back to the cardiovascular system, those that are lost in the capillaries. That's really important. The lymphatic system is also going to be important in a number of other ways, which we'll talk about in a separate system lecture. The endocrine system is going to help control blood pressure. We mentioned epinephrine. Sometimes it causes vasodilation, sometimes it causes vasoconstriction. That seems to be contradictory, but actually it depends. The response of various organs to the same hormone is not always the same. So some vessels dilate and some vessels constrict, and there has been an evolution of adjusted responses that maximize benefit. Norepinephrine causes vasoconstriction. Norepinephrine is usually synergistic to epinephrine, not always, but usually. And remember, those are both released by the adrenal glands. Aldosterone is going to be real important in controlling sodium levels, which in turn affects the amount of water that's retained or lost by the kidneys, which in turn affects the blood volume, which in turn affects blood pressure. Antidiuretic hormone, we talked about that, reduces the amount of water loss from the kidneys. ANH reduces the vasoconstriction, allows for vasodilation, reduces cardiac activity. Regulation of urine contents and volume, very, very important and hormonally controlled, and that in turn affects pressure. And also in terms of maintaining blood pressure, we got the skeletal muscle pump and the respiratory pump, both of which have the ability to move blood when there isn't enough blood pressure from cardiac activity to move it. And that affects the amount of blood coming back to the heart, specifically the right atrium. We also have a reflexive response to blood loss. And as soon as you've lost about 10% of your blood volume, this reflexive response is initiated. And it can accommodate up to a loss of about 40% of your blood volume so that you don't have a significant drop in blood pressure. Pretty impressive. Obviously not half, but you can lose a lot of blood and still have relatively normal blood pressure. So what happens during this response is you get sympathetic stimulation from sympathetic nerves. This is in the veins and arterioles, going to cause them to constrict. What would be the effect if your veins and arterioles constrict? Well, it's going to increase peripheral resistance, and it's also going to pump blood back to the heart. And so if you do that, you get more venous return, so the blood can be pumped out, more blood can be pumped out, and the constriction increases peripheral resistance, which increases blood pressure. So both of those things increase the blood pressure. More blood back to the heart raises blood pressure, increased peripheral resistance raises blood pressure. Okay. Sympathetic stimulation to the heart, the effects? Well, it's going to make the heart contract more rapidly and more strongly. And so if you increase the rate and increase the cardiac output, both of those increase the blood pressure. And that gets us through the cardiovascular system. So I hope that you have learned some important things here to help you prepare for the quiz on the cardiovascular system, and also to help you prepare for the exam. And Pansy and I both hope that you have a great day and a productive day in studying for this wonderful course you are taking. Well, we hope you think it's a wonderful course.